Good morning, everyone. I'd love to invite you to open your Bibles, whether it's a physical Bible, a phone, or something different. The verses will come up on the screen, though, so no stress if you haven't got it. So we're in Luke 10, verses 25 to 37, better known as the Good Samaritan. Okay. Luke 10, 25, 37. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" he replied. "How do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength and with all your mind. Love your neighbor as yourself." "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this and you will live." But he wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" In reply, Jesus said, "A man was going down to Jerusalem to Jericho, where he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and then went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed on the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to a place and saw him, passed on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, took pity on him. When he went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. 'Look after him,' he said, 'and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have.' Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers?" The expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." Jesus said, "Go and do likewise." So I believe that the story of the Good Samaritan is simultaneously one of the most well-known and most misunderstood stories in the Bible, at least in Western culture. This parable told by Jesus to a lawyer is often the basis for the kind of the mindset of doing good deeds in our daily lives. And I often hear that phrase, even from my own mum, who has an understanding of the Good Samaritan. And it's usually around something like picking up a piece of rubbish or taking in a neighbour's parcel when they're out. You kind of say, well, that's my good deed done for the day, as if you've kind of ticked that box. It's a little statement that kind of acknowledges the greatness within yourself, which is no bad thing. There's a lot of good stuff in us. But it kind of misses the controversial and countercultural nature of who the Good Samaritan is and what this actually represents. See, the words good and Samaritan were unlikely to have been spoken within the same sentence during the time that this parable was shared. There was an ongoing feud between Jews and Samaritans that had lasted between 500 and 900 years. I know that's a very big gap, but there's a lot there. So they have a lot of stuff behind them to work through. And when the king of Assyria relocated his people into the towns of Samaria, that replaced the Israelites that lived there. And in 2 Kings, I don't have this on the screen, so just listen up. But in 2 Kings, it says, they, the people who relocated to Samaria, honored and worshipped God, but not exclusively. They also appointed all sorts of priests, regardless of the qualification, to conduct a variety of rites at local fertility shrines. They honored and worshipped God, but they also kept up their devotions to the old gods of the places that they came from. And they're still doing it, still worshipping any old god that has nostalgic appeal to them. They don't really worship God. They don't take it seriously what he says regarding how to behave and what to believe. So that's what it says in Kings. So the Samaritans, who were already kind of seen as being like this hybrid, slightly religious but slightly corrupt kind of religion, not quite there but kind of going for it but not quite getting it right, they created a religion for themselves that the Jews would have considered heresy. So to the Jews at this time, a Samaritan was considered to be even worse than a Gentile or a pagan and were considered to have defiled their true religion. And there began 500 to 900 years of division. So this is the context in which you're looking at. In the story or the parable of the Good Samaritan, we are presented with 4 main characters. The first is the man who has been beaten. Now, we don't know too much more about him, except that on a basic level, he needs help. We see throughout the Bible, all over it, that Jesus is an excellent storyteller and is also very intentional with the details that he chooses to put in and leave out. Now, perhaps this is speculative and you can weigh this up yourself, but I wonder if perhaps we aren't supposed to know what this man's circumstances are. We know that he has been beaten by robbers and he's been left half dead. What we don't know is that if this attack was planned, if he deserved it, if he provoked it, or if it was completely random and unjust. And perhaps that's the first slightly more subtle point that Jesus might have been making, that to some extent, this information is less relevant. At a base level, in this character, in this man, we meet a man who is hurt and needs help, and there is nothing else that we need to know. Next, we meet a Levite followed by a priest, 2 more characters. And we read in these verses that both of these people crossed the street upon seeing the man hurt on the other side of the road. Again, speculative, but there are a number of scenarios that are at play here that Jesus could have been pointing towards. My theory is that these people are not horrible people or really, really selfish in crossing the street, but simply that they put their own agenda above the agenda of the person in front of them and the agenda of God's. For example, for a priest or a Levite to touch someone who could potentially be dead or at the very least bleeding would lead them to become ceremonially unclean. In this situation, they both would have had to have done a cleaning ritual. The priest probably wouldn't have been able to go to work that day, and the change of plan would have been a huge inconvenience to them. Now, there may be an array of reasons as to why they crossed the street. It might not have been safe. There could have been other things that we don't know about. My theory, I wonder if it is the most relatable to you. Most of us are normal, mostly nice people who sometimes make selfish choices as we go about our day-to-day lives. We don't love inconvenience because we have busy lives and there's things that we have to get onto and commitments that we have. And I wonder if the Levite and the priest were in a similar situation, not completely ignoring the man, but walking away because they didn't have time to be inconvenienced that day. I wonder if they felt a little bit challenged and awkward turning away from him, similar to how sometimes we may feel when we walk past a person who is homeless without engaging in any form of conversation, because we're not sure what to say or we have things to do. And I wonder if you have ever felt like that. I know I certainly have. Now, the final character that we meet is the Samaritan, named the Good Samaritan. As I've mentioned already, the words good and Samaritan were unlikely to have been found in the same sentence, so that would have been really controversial at the time. Again, Jesus is a great storyteller, and in choosing a Samaritan to be the person who helps to stop an injured man would have got the lawyers back up as he was sharing the story. Now, I'm not going to name people groups or organizations now, but I'm sure we can all think of examples of people groups that we wouldn't name to be good. And yet, this is exactly the type of person that Jesus has chosen to represent the helper in this story. Not the religious leader, not a member of the Hebrew tribe, not even giving one of his own disciples as an example, but someone who has a myriad of messed up beliefs and would have been shunned in society. And this is the person that he names to be good. I'm going to pause for a moment, because I want you guys, I know this is a preach, but I do love it when there's a bit of interaction. So I want you guys to speak with the people around you, maybe the people that you prayed with. If you prayed by yourself, please join a group for this bit. And I want to ask the question of, why do you think that Jesus uses this man to demonstrate kindness and generosity to the injured man, and not the priest, the Levite, or anyone else? So literally just a couple of minutes, and then I'm going to get my very helpful runner in Brett to run around and share some answers. So a couple of minutes, people around you, go. Okay, wrap those conversations up. I know you only gave you like 1 minute, but hopefully you've shared some thoughts. I'm going to give my mic to my runner, i.e. my husband. Thank you.
Thanks.
Oh, are you on?
Yeah?
Hey, great. Okay, if you can raise your hand if you heard something or you said something good. If you said something good, you can still put your hand up. Don't worry about it. Right. So why do we think that Jesus uses him to show compassion? Hands up. Oh, we've got one up, Brett. Got all the way to the other side of the corner. Run, 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 run. If someone over here could be next, that would be great.
I like making people run over the end of the room. I think it's because there's no expectation of good from that person. It's to break down the prejudice of expectation of it being our own good or who we are already. It's God seeing all people equally.
Really good. Thanks, Lorna. Have we got anyone else? Oh, Margaret down here.
The fact that you don't need any particular qualification for God to use you, that if you're willing and able, then he's more than happy to use you. You don't have to be a priest or a Levite. Yeah, that's so good. It's showing that by him, he was the one who didn't cross the road, so that's an action showing that he was open, so that's good. One more. Got one more. Come on down here, Brett. That's it. He's good, isn't he?
It's a question that everybody deserves compassion, and the man who went to help him was taking no account of all these mores that were going around at the time. He just saw an injured man, and that was his main reason for being compassionate and going over to help him. And this is it. We should put all the things on one side and just think about, how would we feel in that way? If we were in that position, and just a human being needing our help and give it in God's name.
Yeah, that's it. I love it. Thank you. That's great. Brett, if you just get that back to mine. Thank you. Amazing. Thanks, guys. So in this parable, Jesus could have been making a number of points as to why he chose to use the Samaritan as the helper, but here's one of my thoughts. Firstly, the scripture in the NIV version reads that he took pity on the man. But the original translation, I'm not going to try and say it. I'm not Zach, so I can't do that. But it means to be moved with compassion. That's what it translates as, rather than took pity, which I think has slightly different connotations. And there are lots of ways that you can be compassionate towards someone, but chances are it might come a little bit easier if you know how they're feeling and you've experienced it too. And we see this in a lot of charities and volunteer groups. For example, Food Bank is a great one. Many of the volunteers that are serving week on week have also experienced food poverty themselves, so they know exactly how that feels to be in their situation. And they are well equipped to be compassionate because they can relate on more of a personal and slightly deeper level. And I wonder if, similarly to the injured man, the Samaritan would have also experienced pain, abuse, feeling outcast from society, and therefore is very well positioned to share compassion. The opposite of this is also true, though. It's really hard to relate to people sometimes who have had very different life experiences to us. And at this season of life that I'm at, I often find myself talking to my friends and siblings who have become new mums for the first time. And I find myself saying things like, I know it must be really tough right now. But I don't. I've got absolutely no idea what it's like because I'm not a parent myself. So while I can be generous and show compassion and be kind to them, it's also totally okay to acknowledge that our experiences are not always the same as someone else's, and we don't need to have guilt for that. But it is something that we can pray about, that God gives us insight into someone's life so that we know how to show compassion with his help. For the Levite and the priest, there were barriers to showing compassion in the face of injustice. The Samaritan man overcame some of these barriers in trying to help him. And I'm just going to look at 3 barriers now that these could have been and ask ourselves if any of them relate to us. It may be that you relate to all 3. I certainly have at different times in my life, or maybe you just relate to one right now. The first one is an aversion to inconvenience. Much of life is being inconvenienced by plans not going the way we think we ought to. My job, my profession is literally a planner. So I am very used to things not going my way, and it doesn't always feel nice. So I get it. And I want to share a story about an elderly man who used to live on our street, just as an example. This man was in his later years in life, shall we say, and we often saw him hobbling up and down our road outside our house. And we enjoyed chatting with him now and again, and he would come to the front door sometimes, and he would knock, and we would open the door, and he would just stand there. He didn't say anything to us, sometimes a few words, but most of the time he would just stand there in silence and look at us. And I would think, what on earth am I doing here? Sometimes we invited him in for him to continue to not speak to us, and other times we weren't able to, or if I'm honest, I just didn't want to invite him in, like, let's be real. And sometimes he would walk past the window and he'd see me, and honestly, I would pray, please don't knock on the door today, I just don't have time for it. He was a tricky man, and not the easiest neighbor to love, but not the hardest either. And one day he knocked on our door, which wasn't particularly out of the ordinary. And now, if you're squeamish here, this is your invitation to cover your ears for about 15 seconds. But I opened the door to find him standing there in the cold, his trouser leg pulled up to his knee, with blood running down his leg to his ankles. In a panic, we invited him in, and he told me that he'd been trying to call his doctors to get through, but he couldn't get any help. And he remembered that Brett worked for the NHS. And at this point, we didn't know much about his story, but we also had a full day of meetings working from home, and we just didn't have time. But we invited him in, because what are you going to do when there's an older man standing on your doorstep with his leg bleeding? So anyone who has been to our house will be able to recall two things. The first is that our front door opens right onto our lounge, and the second is that in our lounge is a cream-coloured rug. Now, I'm quite house proud. And I'd love to tell you that in this moment, the biggest concern for me was his health. But honestly, while Brett was getting him settled into the living room, I was running around with a dust sheet trying to cover the rug. While Brett helped clean up his wounds and find out what happened, I called his surgery and finally got through, and he was seen later that day. And in total, this took about 3 hours. We missed our meetings, and Brett used up most of his first aid kit at home, and we had to explain to our managers about what was happening. But you know what? The world didn't collapse. The plan for the day, my plan anyway, was hugely inconvenienced, but it was kind of a gift when he came to us when he was hurt, because he knew that there was a neighbor that would help, even if we did so slightly reluctantly. And I'm not going to lie and say that from that moment on we had a fabulous relationship with him, but something did shift. And he was no longer the slightly odd man who lived on our street, who knocked on our door but never spoke to us. And we weren't just another younger couple on the street, a street that he's seen change populations and families so much in the last 45 years. But instead, we had a common story that revolved around kindness, generosity, and the openness to being inconvenienced. I think perhaps we have an aversion to inconvenience. I think all of us probably do a little bit. And maybe that's okay. And maybe we need boundaries. For example, not letting him in every single time he came to the door. But too often, we set our boundaries as fences to hold people out, rather than gates that actually enable us to let people in. So why do we have an aversion to inconvenience? Is it because deep down we might think that our plan for the day is better than God's plan for the day? Is it that our calendars are maybe a little too packed? I was going to do a question here, Brian, but I'm skipping it because I'm sharing too many stories, so just ignore that. So there are so many ways that we can overcome an aversion to inconvenience, but I'm just going to share one thing that has helped me. The main thing that has helped me is don't overpack your diary. And I know some of you in this room will be thinking, I can't help but that. I have a full diary, I have kids, I have meetings, I have all these things. And maybe you do have kids that go to a million clubs. I lead one of our God's gangs, and I've honestly never met such sociable kids in my whole life. I felt my childhood was boring compared to theirs. And it's amazing that they've got all this stuff going on. And maybe you've got a really demanding job, and I get that. Or maybe you're the opposite end of the spectrum where you feel like you shouldn't feel as stressed as you do because you don't have as much on your plate as other people do, and yet you still feel overwhelmed. And all of these experiences are valid, and sometimes, whether it's kids, jobs, or something else, we go through seasons that are fuller than other seasons, and that's okay. But we can't treat our entire calendar like it's a sprint when it's actually meant to be a marathon. We'll just burn out. Shortly before our elderly neighbour came to our door with his bleeding leg, I felt God challenge me to literally make room for inconvenience in my diary. So where my Google Calendar was filled back to back with an array of things, there was no space for me to mess up, let alone anyone else to come into our lives. And I'm so thankful that God gave me that heads up before he came to the door, because honestly, if Brett wasn't there, I might not have even opened our front door that day. So can I challenge you for a second? Whatever season of life you're in, God created the season of life that you are in. And he still wants you to have a relationship with him in any way that is accessible and doable for you right now. But if you are too busy to listen to God and to do what he's asking you to do, then you are too busy. Often we treat busyness like it's a crown to wear and tiredness like it's a badge of honor. But it's not. It's the first step of burnout. And what good are we to the kingdom when we're burnt out? Perhaps there are boundaries that need to be set with your time that allow you to be inconvenienced. And boundaries are setting is a whole other talk, which I'm not going to go into. But I want you to consider your diary and ask, are you giving yourself room to be inconvenienced by God? And once you've done this, I want you to ask yourself, who is my neighbor every single day? You'll be glad to know that barrier 2 and 3 are slightly shorter. So barrier 2, compassion fatigue. Now, let's be honest, there are needs all around us, in our neighborhoods, on the news, on social media, on our friendship groups, in our families, and in our jobs. It's pretty persistent and tiring, whatever stage of life you are at. Brett recently shared a story with me, which I thought was really lovely, that when he was growing up in a quiet suburb in Essex, he and his family would pray for every single emergency vehicle that went past their house because it was so rare to see one. The idea that someone may have been in need close to them, somewhere near their home, led them to show compassion in the form of prayer. Now, we live on a very busy street, 10 minutes from the city centre, on an ambulance route, 2 minutes away from an area where there's loads of crime. So sirens are just part of our soundtrack of our lives. And the difference could not be made more clear when we see our dog, Lottie, and Brett's parents' dog, Ralph, react to police cars zooming up the road. There's Lottie and Ralph behind me. Lottie, our dog, who has been raised on a very busy street, doesn't flinch because she's just so used to the noise. Ralph, on the other hand, was raised on the farm for the first few years of his life, and then a suburb in Essex, and flinches and jumps at the sound of sirens. Perhaps our own compassion fatigue has led us not to flinch, because like Lottie, we're just so used to the noise happening around us that we don't react in the same way anymore. Now, I'm not saying we should flinch and jump like Ralph either, but when we hear a piece of information or news that is an injustice, it can be an indication of God's Spirit moving within us to pray and sometimes take action. A really helpful antidote to compassion fatigue is, again, healthy boundaries. I watched an incredible TV show. Raise your hand if you watched the TV show Breathtaking on ITV. Yeah? Or literally one, guys. Oh, a couple over here. It's so good and so interesting. And it's a kind of documentary type thing about COVID. Now, I found it really interesting, and when I find something interesting, I want to share it with Brett. However, what is not helpful to him is after working an 11-hour shift in the NHS with patients, some of them with COVID, is to watch a show that brings up the similar feelings of when he has set a boundary to rest well. I'm also a big fan of Grey's Anatomy, but I don't really watch that when he's around either for the same reason. Many of us have to show compassion in our daily lives, in our jobs, in our places we volunteer, and with our families. But it has to be said that there are particular jobs where it just feels harder. NHS workers, social workers, teachers, care workers, church leaders, charity workers, just to name a few, and I am very aware that I'm missing loads. There are so many ways in our day-to-day life that we do actually really show compassion. So we need boundaries. We need to be wise with what we allow ourselves to consume and how much of it. How we use our phones, if we allow news notifications to come through, if we're always accessible to other people at all hours. I want to ask you, when was the last time you took a Sabbath day? Sabbath used to be something that I actually hated because I'm not very good at rest. Now I look forward to it, and it's the best thing. We need to guard our hearts because when God does put people in front of us who need compassion, we need to be ready to step up and bless them, not giving up from an empty cup. And my last one, sorry, I know I'm going over, is a true or felt lack of resources. It is true that we are in a cost of living crisis right now, and giving does feel like an extra sacrifice at the moment, whether it's finances or time. There are a number of ways in the story of the Good Samaritan that resources are shared, and they aren't just financial. It says, he went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. He also said that he'll reimburse him. That's 5 ways, just in a few sentences, that he helped him. He did a number of things. He did the bandages, oil and wine, much like an emergency kit in a car or a first aid kit. He put him on a donkey, much like lending him a car, which Mike and Pippa did for us when we needed one, which is amazing, or just paying for his bus fare. He took care of him. Maybe that was just by speaking to him or listening to him. He also found him somewhere to sleep and offered to pay. Not all of us can do all of this, but all of us can do some of this. All of us can listen to someone in need and hold a conversation when seemingly no one else will. The vast majority of us could buy someone a cup of coffee or offer a little bit of food if needed. Some of us will be able to give a bit more financially, and a few of us will be able to open up our homes to those in need. I personally think that Jesus cares a lot less about what we do to serve others, but more about our heart posture when we serve others. I'm going to invite the band up now. I want us to normalize sacrifice. There is nothing in the Bible that says that walking with Jesus will be easy. It does say that there's a cost, but it also says that there's abundance. I want you to think for a second, right back at the start, when the lawyer in the Good Samaritan story asks, "Who is my neighbor?" What I think he's really asking is, who is not my neighbor, so I don't have to love them? I think that's the question behind the question. So I want us to think about that cost that Jesus is asking us. Because sacrifice is not meant to be easy, especially when we're new to this as well. And if I want to just leave you with one challenge. If loving people feels comfortable and easy, I want you to consider who you're following and who you're walking with and who is leading you. Because Jesus equips us for really hard people and hard circumstances. So there's going to be a couple of questions that come up on the screen. I'm not going to get you to discuss it. I want you to consider particularly the second one while we worship. And that is, what resources do you have in your hands or your home that you can use to show compassion to others? So I'd like to invite us to stand as we worship together.